Welcome to this explainer on the French Revolution. We are looking at a wildly chaotic 10-year stretch from 1789 to 1799 where France swung violently from an absolute monarchy right into a bold experiment in democratic citizenship, plunged into state-sponsored terror, and eventually landed right back into an autocracy. It's honestly one of the most incredible and turbulent watersheds in human history, and we're going to break down exactly how it happened, step by step.
All right, let's dive right in by looking at the deeply unequal society of 1789 France. The population was legally and very rigidly divided into three tiers, which they called the estates. The first estate, the Catholic clergy, made up less than 1% of the population, yet they owned 10% of the land and paid absolutely zero taxes. The second estate, the nobility, was about 2%. They held all the high offices and were also completely exempt from direct taxation. And then you have that massive slice, 97%, the third estate. This was everyone else, from wealthy merchants all the way down to rural peasants. They bore the entire financial tax burden of the state, but possessed absolutely zero political voice.
You can practically see the foundation cracking here, right? This incredibly top-heavy, rigid system was pushed to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. Why? Well, imagine 2 decades of severe fiscal mismanagement, a totally archaic tax system, and the massive, crippling debts France took on by funding the American Revolution. The nation was structurally insolvent. They were completely out of money, and the people at the very top were refusing to pay a single dime to fix it.
Then, nature steps in and turns a financial crisis into a total human catastrophe. In 1788, France was hit by severe droughts, followed by a totally brutal winter. By the spring of 1789, hyperinflation hits hard. The cost of a single loaf of bread skyrocketed to equal a typical laborer's entire daily wage. Think about that for a second, working all day long just to afford one single loaf of bread for your family.
So, this stark economic reality ignites widespread famine and mass rioting. And it brings us to a really visceral question, one that basically drives the rest of our explainer. What exactly happens when a starving population with zero political voice reaches its absolute breaking point? You know, when survival is on the line, the boiling pot inevitably spills over.
And that brings us to Phase 1, the constitutional experiment running from 1789 to 1791, where the heavily outvoted Third Estate breaks away to form the National Assembly.
To really understand this boiling point, we have to look at the government. King Louis XVI had summoned an assembly to approve new taxes, but that massive Third Estate we talked about, they were constantly outvoted by the tiny nobility and clergy, so they simply broke away. Fearing a royal military crackdown in response, an angry urban mob took action on July 14, 1789. They stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison that served as a massive symbol of royal tyranny, and crucially, held the city's gunpowder stores. This wasn't just a riot, it was literally the collapse of royal authority in a single day.
Shortly after the Bastille fell, this newly empowered assembly drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Their goal was monumental. They abolished feudal privileges entirely and attempted to replace the ancient autocratic system with a constitutional monarchy. For a brief, shining moment, it actually looked like France might transition smoothly into an experiment in democratic citizenship and individual rights. But then we move to Phase 2, the fall of the monarchy and war. By 1792, the revolution grows incredibly volatile.
This volatility exploded because back in June 1791, King Louis XVI and his family tried to secretly flee the country to rally foreign intervention. That ultimate betrayal totally shattered public trust, and a panicked France preemptively declared war on Austria and Prussia. To understand how the nation polarized during this wartime chaos, we have to neutrally examine 3 main political factions. First up, the Royalists, led by figures like Lafayette, who advocated for a stable constitutional monarchy. As things radicalized, they were suppressed, exiled, or executed. Then we have the Girondins, led by Brissot. They were moderate Republicans who actively opposed executing the king. They were ultimately purged from power. Finally, you have the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre. They were extreme, radical Republicans allied with urban workers, favoring total centralization and state terror to preserve their republic.
As wartime losses mounted and internal counter-revolutions flared up, power shifted entirely away from the reform-minded moderates, which ushers in Phase 3, the Reign of Terror, from 1793 to 1794, where power shifts entirely to the extreme Jacobins.
See, the absolute monarchy wasn't just weakened at this point. It was definitively, violently abolished. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was publicly executed via guillotine. This single drop of the blade permanently accelerated the radical phase of the revolution. There was absolutely no turning back now.
To protect this fragile new republic from perceived internal traitors, Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety essentially goes to war with its own people. The new constitution? Entirely suspended. State-sponsored terror officially became government policy. An estimated 17,000 to 40,000 enemies of the revolution were systematically executed by the guillotine. And these targets weren't just the King and Queen Marie Antoinette. They eventually included many of the original revolutionary leaders who were suddenly deemed, well, not radical enough.
But, of course, a society can only sustain that level of intense paranoia and bloodshed for so long, leading us to the Thermidorian reaction in 1794, where the pendulum violently swings back. By July, the relentless pace of the guillotine had just completely exhausted the public. Fearing they would literally be next on the execution lists, a legislative coalition turns against Robespierre. Let's break down exactly how they dismantled this terror state. Step 1. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre is arrested, and, in a deeply poetic twist of revolutionary justice, he's executed the very next day. Step 2. The Thermidorian reaction systematically purges the remaining radical Jacobins and lifts those extreme economic regulations. And Step 3. Executive control is handed over to a 5-member committee known as the Directory. But keep an eye on this. The Directory was highly corrupt and extremely weak.
And that weakness sets the stage for our final act, the rise of Napoleon in 1799, marking the definitive end of the revolutionary decade.
After the terror, the Directory struggled massively to maintain order. They relied heavily on military force just to suppress constant leftist food riots and right-wing royalist uprisings. This created a massive, gaping political vacuum. Capitalizing on all this deep national instability, a brilliantly popular military general named Napoleon Bonaparte saw his opportunity. In November 1799, he launched a wildly successful coup d'état, easily overthrowing the struggling Directory. So, let's step back and put this incredible decade into perspective. Back in 1789, France is ruled by an absolute monarchy, which sparks a revolution demanding democratic citizenship and shared power. Yet by 1799, Napoleon names himself First Consul. He effectively ends the 10-year democratic experiment and concentrates all that hard-fought power right back into a single executive authority. Which leaves us with this final, really lingering thought to consider. After an agonizing decade of unprecedented bloodshed, hyperinflation, the storming of fortresses, and radical upheaval, did the French Revolution actually achieve its soaring democratic ideals? Or did it merely swap out an autocratic monarch with a crown for a new autocratic emperor with a different title? It's a fascinating cycle of history that shows just how fragile democratic experiments can truly be.